Royce Gracie, November 12, 1993, Denver, Colorado. A 170-pound Brazilian in a white G stands across from a 216-pound boxer named Art Jimerson. Jimerson is wearing one boxing glove, just one, because nobody knew what would happen in there. Royce Gracie looked like he wandered in from a karate class, thin, unassuming. His opponents towered over him. They outweighed him by 40, 50, sometimes 90 pounds, and in a single night, he would fight 3 of them. There were no rounds, no judges, no point system. You won by knockout, submission, or your corner throwing in the towel. That was it, and Royce won. Not once, not twice. He won the entire tournament. Then he did it again and again. But here's what people forget. Royce wasn't dominating. He was surviving. Watch the footage from those early UFCs. Royce gets hit hard. He takes punches that would end modern fights. He bleeds. His gi gets soaked with sweat and sometimes blood. In UFC 1, he submitted 3 men in under 5 minutes combined. But by UFC 3, his fights were getting longer, more brutal. He fought Kimo Leopoldo for nearly 5 minutes in a fight so violent that Royce won but couldn't continue in the tournament. His corner had to carry him out. There was no IV therapy waiting, no CT scans, no medical team checking for concussions, just ice and water, and the question, can you fight again tonight? Royce fought in an era where technique was your only protection. There were no gloves to cushion the blows, no referee stepping in early. If you got hurt, you either finished the fight or you didn't. And Royce proved that skill could overcome size and power, but not without cost. His career in that original UFC era was short, brilliant, revolutionary, but short, because fighting 3 men in one night every few months destroys the body, even if you win. Royce Gracie didn't just win fights, he survived them. And in doing so, he showed the world that martial arts worked. But he also, that without limits, without rest, without protection, even the toughest fighters break.
Mark Coleman changed MMA forever with a simple strategy. Take him down and never let him up. He was a Division I NCAA wrestling champion, a Greco-Roman Olympic alternate, and when he entered the UFC, he brought a style nobody had an answer for. Ground and pound. Pin your opponent, control their body, and hit them until they can't continue. It was devastatingly effective and devastatingly brutal. Coleman won UFC 10 and UFC 11 back-to-back. He became the first UFC heavyweight champion. He looked unstoppable. But there was a problem. His style required him to absorb as much damage as he delivered. Wrestling someone to the ground means clinching. Clinching means eating punches and elbows. Holding someone down means they're hitting you from the bottom. Coleman's fights were wars, not technical exhibitions. Wars. And wars destroy soldiers. By the time MMA started implementing rounds and time limits, Coleman was already worn down. His cardio suffered from years of explosive, violent fights. His body couldn't recover the way it used to. Modern fighters trained for 5-minute rounds with 1-minute breaks. Coleman trained to fight until someone quit. When the sport changed, his body couldn't adapt. He kept fighting into his 40s, kept taking punishment, because that's what you did in that era. You fought until you couldn't anymore, and Coleman couldn't anymore long before he stopped trying. Mark Coleman proved that wrestling dominance could control MMA, but he also proved that success in a sport without structure costs you everything. If you're realizing just how insane early MMA was, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started, and what's coming next is even more brutal. Let's keep going.
Dan Severn fought 100 times in MMA. Read that again, 100 fights. Not over 20 years with careful matchmaking and long breaks. Over a decade, while also competing in professional wrestling and grappling tournaments. Severn was the definition of an old-school fighter. Mustache, singlet, no flash, just control. He would take you down, hold you there, and either submit you or exhaust you until you gave up. He wasn't exciting. He was effective. But here's the thing about fighting that often. Your body becomes a catalog of injuries. Severn fought with broken hands, torn muscles, joint damage, concussions that never got properly diagnosed because concussion protocols didn't exist. You got knocked out, you woke up, you fought again next month. In UFC 4, Severn fought 3 times in one night, won the whole tournament, then fought again a few months later, then again, and again. Modern fighters might compete 3 times in a year. Severn fought 15 times in 1995 alone. This wasn't dedication. This was survival. Early MMA didn't pay well. You fought often because you needed the money, and you fought hurt because pulling out meant no paycheck. Severn's longevity is impressive until you realize what it cost him. He fought well into his 50s, not because he was still competitive, because he couldn't stop. The body doesn't forget that kind of punishment. It accumulates, stores it, and eventually, it breaks down. Dan Severn proved that endurance and toughness could build a legendary career, but he also proved that fighting without protection, without rest, without limits, leaves scars that never heal.
Tank Abbott. Tank Abbott didn't fight to win. He fought to hurt people. Brawler, bar fighter, street legend. Tank Abbott looked like a bouncer who wandered into the octagon by mistake. Big beard, heavy hands, zero technique, and absolutely no interest in grappling, submissions, or anything that wasn't punching someone unconscious. He was everything early UFC promoted: raw, unfiltered, dangerous. Tank's fights were spectacles of violence. When he knocked out John Matua at UFC 6, Matua went stiff, convulsing on the canvas. The crowd roared, the commentators panicked. Tank walked away like it was just another night. That image, that moment, became one of the reasons politicians tried to ban MMA. It looked too brutal, too uncontrolled, too much like the human cockfighting critics called it. But Tank's career also shows the limits of pure violence. He won some, lost more. Fighters with technique learned to avoid his power and submit him. Wrestlers took him down and controlled him. His style worked when MMA was chaos. When it became a sport, he became a relic, and his body paid the price. Brain trauma from absorbing punches, hand injuries from throwing them. A career built on violence and nothing else leaves you with nothing when the violence ends. Tank Abbott represented the darkest side of early MMA, the side that didn't care about safety or longevity or athlete welfare, the side that just wanted to see someone get knocked out cold. And that side almost destroyed the sport before it could grow.
Gary Goodridge. Gary Goodridge is one of the saddest stories in MMA history. Arm wrestling champion turned fighter, powerful striker, dangerous on the feet, and absolutely fearless. At UFC 8, he knocked out Paul Herrera with elbows so brutal
into the thigh that didn't look devastating until his opponents tried to move and their legs gave out. He submitted Paul Varelans, a 6'8", 300-pound giant, because Varelans couldn't walk after the leg kicks. Ruas proved that MMA wasn't about being the best wrestler or the best striker. It was about being the most complete. But being complete also meant absorbing more damage. Ruas fought strikers who could knock him out, grapplers who could submit him, wrestlers who could control him. Every fight was dangerous in multiple ways, and his career, like so many others from that era, was short. Marco Ruas showed the future of MMA, but he did it in an era that destroyed bodies before they could reach their potential. We're almost at the end, but before we get there, do me a favor. Drop a like on this video. These stories need to be told, and your support makes sure they reach more people. Now, let's talk about how these fighters changed everything. By the late 1990s, MMA was dying. Politicians were trying to ban it. Senator John McCain called it human cockfighting. States were refusing to sanction events. Pay-per-view providers were dropping coverage. The UFC was hemorrhaging money. And the reason was simple. It looked too dangerous. Because it was too dangerous. Fighters were getting seriously hurt. Careers were ending in minutes. The lack of rules, the lack of structure, the lack of medical oversight, all of it made MMA look barbaric. And the bodies piling up proved it wasn't just optics. Something had to change. The unified rules of MMA were introduced in 2000. Weight classes, rounds, time limits, fouls, banned techniques, mandatory gear, referee oversight. Everything that makes modern MMA a regulated sport came from watching what happened to fighters in the 90s. Royce Gracie fighting 3 times in one night? Banned. Now you get weeks, sometimes months between fights. Ken Shamrock fighting for 36 minutes straight? Banned. Now fights have 5-minute rounds with breaks. Tank Abbott knocking someone unconscious with no follow-up care? Banned. Now fighters get medical evaluations after every knockout. The sport didn't change because promoters cared about fighter safety. It changed because the alternative was extinction, and the proof was written in the scars, the injuries, and the broken bodies of the men who fought before the rules existed. These fighters didn't just compete, they were test subjects, guinea pigs in an experiment to see how far the human body could be pushed, and their suffering gave MMA the data it needed to survive.
When you watch modern MMA, you're watching a sport. Weight classes ensure fair fights. Rounds give fighters time to recover. Referees stop fights before permanent damage occurs. Doctors check for injuries. Commissions enforce medical suspensions. Fighters have unions, health insurance, retirement plans. None of that existed for the men we talked about today. Royce Gracie fought 3 men in one night with no protection. Ken Shamrock fought for 36 minutes with no breaks. Mark Coleman wrestled until his body gave out. Dan Severn fought 100 times because there was no one to tell him to stop. Tank Abbott knocked people unconscious with no medical follow-up. Gary Goodridge is living with brain damage because he fought too many times in too short a span. Marco Ruiz showed the future, but paid the price of the past. These men bled so MMA could become safe. They sacrificed their bodies so future generations wouldn't have to. They fought in a sport that didn't care about them, and their pain forced that sport to evolve. Modern MMA exists because these fighters proved it needed to change. So the next time you watch a championship fight with all its rules, regulations, and safety measures, remember the men who fought when none of that existed. Remember the fighters who bled first. If this video gave you a new perspective on MMA history, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.